Okay, let's jump right in. Think about the last time you watched a documentary. You were probably expecting to see, well, the truth, right?
Hmm.
But what happens to truth when it's filmed, cut, and, shaped into a story?
Yeah.
What does reality even mean when it appears on screen?
That's the core puzzle, isn't it?
Hmm.
And it's exactly what our source material really digs into. We've taken a deep dive into an excerpt from this fascinating book exploring the history and sort of the definition of documentary film.
Okay.
And it really opens your eyes to how complex it all is. It seems straightforward, factual filmmaking, but it's not.
Totally. So, our mission in this deep dive then is to pull out the most important nuggets from these sources, explore this really rich history of documentary, and see how filmmakers have wrestled with this whole idea of showing real life.
Right, for like a century now. And the key insight right from the start, the
Mm.
thing you really need to grasp is that documentary is far from being a simple, objective mirror just reflecting reality.
Mm.
As the source puts it, it's fundamentally a creative treatment of actuality.
Creative treatment of actuality.
Yeah, that phrase itself tells you this is an art form. It involves choices. It's not just a recording.
Okay, let's unpack that. Creative treatment. It immediately makes you wonder, what is a documentary, really? Is it just like pointing a camera at something real?
Well, that's the central debate, and our source shows it's been that way since, well, the very beginning. It's not about capturing raw, unedited real life, but about making pictures of real life,
Yeah.
using reality as the raw material.
Right.
Think of it, make a picture, right? That involves choosing the frame, the focus, the timing.
Right, and before the word documentary even existed, there were films showing, bits of the real world, but they didn't call them that.
Exactly. The source points out that in the early days, there was a lot of confusion about terminology. These early works showing reality were labeled things like actuality films, travel films, educational films, sometimes featurettes. The definition just wasn't settled.
So, who came up with documentary and when did that actually happen?
Okay, so that moment arrived in 1926.
Hmm.
A guy named John Grierson used the term when he was reviewing Robert Flaherty's film Moana.
Moana. Okay.
Yeah, it depicted life on a South Seas island. Grierson called it a documentary
Yeah.
and famously defined it as,
The creative treatment of actuality.
that's the one.
Yeah.
And that phrase is so powerful because it acknowledges right there that while the source is real, the process is creative, it's interpretive.
And that phrase, it feels like it captures the fundamental tension, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
The film claims credibility because it's about real life, but the very act of making it, choosing what to film, editing, adding sound, building a story that involves selection and, well, maybe manipulation.
It's a story about real life claiming credibility. That's how the source puts it.
Mm-hmm.
And that tension is crucial to understanding pretty much every documentary you watch. And it sets up this kind of unspoken contract with the viewer.
Contract, like what the audience expects when they sit down to watch.
Precisely. When you watch a documentary, you have an expectation.
Yeah.
Right? You expect it to be an honest and fair representation of a person's experience. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be absolutely 100% truthful or completely objective about the entire reality, because honestly, that's often impossible.
Right.
But there's a sense of fairness and honesty required.
Yeah.
The filmmaker has to decide, what is acceptable and how to be true to that contract they make with you, the audience.
Okay, I get that. So you're not looking for like raw surveillance footage. You're looking for a story about reality that feels true to the experience, even if it's crafted. It's not just a window, it's a picture.
A picture involving choices, yes. And those choices, right from the start, varied wildly among the early pioneers who really established the documentary form.
Our source material gets into those founding figures, and they definitely had very different ideas about how to make those pictures of real life.
Oh, completely different. The source highlights three key figures: Robert Flaherty, Dziga Vertov, and John Grierson. These guys really laid the groundwork, each with a totally distinct vision.
Okay, let's start with Flaherty. Nanook of the North. That's probably his most famous one, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Robert Flaherty. He's often called a romantic realist.
Romantic realist, okay.
His early films, Nanook of the North from 1922 and Man of Erin from 1934, were incredibly influential. They captured this sense of, human struggle against powerful natural forces. Very elemental.
But Nanook is also the film that sparks that whole early debate about staging, isn't it?
That's where the creative treatment gets really interesting, where controversy popped up later.
Mm.
Flaherty was actually famous for staging and reenacting scenes to build dramatic effect in narrative structure.
Really? Like what?
Well, in Nanook, for instance, he had the subjects use traditional hunting methods, like with spears, even though they were actually using rifles by then. He also kind of assembled a family unit for the film that didn't reflect their actual relationships.
No way.
Yeah. And he even changed the main subject's real name to Nanook because, what, it sounded better, presumably.
Wait, he staged the hunting and
Yeah.
changed the name? So right from the very beginning, documentary wasn't just observing.
No, not at all. The insight here is that even when trying to capture an authentic feeling or sense of a culture, Flaherty felt he had to shape things, even invent details, to create a more compelling story. His big focus was on that elemental struggle of man against nature. He had this romantic view of the Inuit as untouched, which, some later saw as a bit patronizing.
I can see that.
And technically, he used heavy cameras, complex lighting setups, careful editing montage, not just to record, but to create the illusion of observing reality. It just proves how deeply crafted documentary was, even way back then.
So Flaherty was all about this crafted emotional reality. Who was the complete opposite of that approach?
That would definitely be Dziga Vertov. He was pretty radical and explicitly rejected staging, actors, scripts, the whole lot.
He had that Kino eye idea, right? The camera as a sort of mechanical eye, seen better than us.
Exactly. His Kino eye concept was that the camera could capture reality objectively, seeing things the human eye couldn't, free from human bias or limitations. He wanted to capture life spontaneously as it was. He famously declared cinema should basically throw out the love story, the psychological novel, and just embrace open reality.
And Man with a Movie Camera is the big example of this, right? That film is wild.
It is. His 1929 film, often called A Symphony of a Great City, it's just this dazzling display of everyday life captured spontaneously, but it's also full of technical camera tricks and incredibly dynamic editing. Vertov believed the camera could see purely, but crucially, that the filmmaker's job was to organize the chaos of real life through montage, through editing, to reveal its underlying meaning.
Huh. So even the guy trying to be totally objective acknowledged the need for creative intervention through editing. That's interesting.
It is, isn't it? It highlights that even for Vertov, simply pointing the camera wasn't enough. Structuring the captured reality was essential. His work was super provocative, sparked huge debates, and while he faced professional difficulties in the Soviet system later on, his radical ideas and use of montage had this massive global influence on filmmakers who came after.
Okay, so Flaherty, Vertov, and then there's John Grierson, the guy who actually gave the genre its name. What was his angle?
Grierson brought a completely different perspective again. He tied documentary fundamentally to social purpose. He worked for government bodies, first in Britain, then later in Canada, and he saw a documentary as this powerful tool for public education and social progress, like a way to get the public engaged with important issues.
So less about individual struggle like Flaherty or the mechanics of seeing like Vertov, and more about using film for something bigger.
For the community.
Precisely. Grierson was maybe less focused on the film as an art object in itself and more on its spirit, its ability to serve the public good. He was influenced by the philosopher John Dewey, who believed an informed public was absolutely essential for democracy. Grierson thought people working together for the common good needed knowledge, and documentary could provide that knowledge.
And he set up institutions to make that happen.
Yeah, he was instrumental in founding major institutions like the National Film Board of Canada, creating a real infrastructure for this kind of purposeful filmmaking.
Wow. So you've got this foundational tension right from the start. Flaherty's crafted emotional realism, often using staging, Vertov's attempt at mechanical, objective truth revealed through montage, and Grierson's focus on film as a tool for social good. Three really different takes on what that creative treatment of actuality actually means.
And those early visions, those debates, they're really the roots of the incredibly diverse range of documentary styles we see today. The genre didn't just stay put, it exploded into all these different flavors.
Okay, let's explore some of those branches then, the different types of documentary that our source material gets into.
Sounds good. First up, we have propaganda and issues films.
Right. The word propaganda immediately makes you think of films trying to persuade you, maybe push a specific agenda, often political.
That's exactly what they are usually. Government propaganda documentaries are funded by governments and explicitly designed to persuade viewers towards a specific viewpoint. They often borrow the look and feel of journalistic credibility to seem objective. The source mentions some infamous examples, like Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. Hugely controversial. She always claimed it was art, not propaganda. But
yeah, that's a tough sell.
Right. Then there are films like Frank Capra's Why We Fight series from the U.S. during World War II, or Humphrey Jennings's Listen to Britain, which aimed to create a very particular impression of wartime life and resilience.
So they're using the documentary form, that claim of showing reality, to serve a specific state purpose.
Exactly. And the source brings up some really striking examples of how potent these films could be perceived to be. John Huston's 1945 film Battle of San Pietro. Apparently, it was so graphic about the human cost of war that the U.S. government initially suppressed it. They were afraid it would just terrify the public too much.
Wow.
Or there was Akira Iwasaki's film about the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, made for the Japanese government. It was confiscated by the U.S. occupation forces. That shows how the perceived truth in documentary can actually be seen as dangerous, as a threat.
Suppressed by the very governments involved. That really highlights the power of the image when it claims to be real.
It really does. Now, issues films are similar in their persuasive goal, but they're typically produced by advocacy groups, NGOs, political organizations, that kind of thing.
Oh.
The source mentions films like Selling of the Pentagon or Walmart, The High Cost of Low Price, as examples films explicitly designed to mobilize action and critique powerful corporations or government policies.
And how did these activist films get seen if, say, traditional TV networks weren't interested?
Well, the source points out that different distribution methods became really crucial. Things like DVD campaigns, screenings organized by the groups themselves, and later, obviously, the internet. These let the films reach audiences directly, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers.
Makes sense.
And it's really important to stress here, just like our source does, and like we're doing, that we're neutrally reporting on the content and the stated aims of these films as discussed in the source. We're not endorsing any specific political viewpoints they contain.
Absolutely. We're here to understand the landscape, the different types, not to take sides on the issues themselves. Okay, what about documentaries looking back in time? History films.
Right, historical documentaries. They use archives, interviews, narration, sometimes reenactments, to tell stories about the past. An early, a really fascinating example the source mentions is Esfer Shub's The Fall of the Romanov Dynasty from 1927. Yeah, she took existing archival footage from the Tsar's reign home movies, newsreels, and edited it together. And she often juxtaposed images like the royal family living in luxury right next to images of poverty and unrest. She let the contrast make the commentary, often without needing a narrator.
That's a really clever, powerful way to use found footage. Very Vertovian in a way, using montage.
It is, isn't it? The source also notes how commercial factors and specific narrative choices heavily shape these films. Ken Burns' The Civil War from 1990 is mentioned as a hugely influential U.S. example, known for its distinctive style, using still photographs, panning across them, voiceovers.
The Ken Burns effect.
Exactly. The source describes it as having a liberal pluralist perspective, which is something historians debate regarding its interpretation. It just shows how even historical narratives presented as fact aren't neutral. They involve interpretation.
And sometimes the history is told through individual experiences, right? Personal stories.
Yes, autobiographical documentaries, or those focusing on personal stories within a historical context. These can add really important dimensions, bringing lived experiences into the historical record. The source mentions Eyes on the Prize, the amazing series on the civil rights movement, as a powerful example of how incorporating personal accounts deeply enriches historical understanding. You get the facts, but also the feeling.
Okay. What about films made explicitly for a mass audience, for entertainment or profit? You know, like those stunning nature documentaries we see all the time.
Yeah, there's definitely a strong commercial side. There's a lineage here going back to early adventure films that were made for commercial success. This evolved into the nature documentary genre we know today. Modern nature docs, like the ones in the BBC or National Geographic, are often highly structured for entertainment value. The source points out they sometimes even stimulate animal behavior. You know, maybe provoke a reaction to get those dramatic cinematic shots.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they meticulously hide any visible human presence, any sign of the cameras or the crew, even though the filmmaking process is incredibly present and controlling behind the scenes.
So those incredible, seemingly spontaneous moments aren't always just stumbled upon. They're often carefully planned, maybe even nudged along a bit.
Precisely. They are highly crafted visual experiences designed to wow you. But they aren't neutral observation. Environmental films aimed at mass audiences, like An Inconvenient Truth from 2006, also fit in here.
Right, the Al Gore film.
Yeah. That film used powerful, persuasive techniques, compelling visuals like flood simulations, melting glaciers alongside Al Gore's lecture format and his personal narrative, all to advocate strongly for climate action. The source notes how it aims to put viewers right in the heart of a natural disaster story, to make it immediate and visceral.
Okay, so we've covered persuasive films, historical ones, commercial and nature docs. What about docs that try to explore different cultures or maybe just seem to try and capture life as it happens more observationally?
Okay, that brings us to ethnographic film and the whole cinema verite movement. Ethnographic film has its roots in anthropology. Initially, it sometimes aims for this pure, objective description of cultures, which, as we've already discussed, is, well, pretty tricky to achieve, if not impossible.
Right. And cinema verite is associated with those portable cameras trying to be a fly on the wall.
Exactly. Jean Rouch is a key figure here, particularly with his film Chronicle of a Summer. He was central to the French cinema verite movement, and he aimed for something different. Collaboration with his subjects. He called it shared anthropology.
Shared anthropology.
Yeah, he actively challenged the traditional dynamic where the filmmaker observes subjects almost like, insects under a microscope.
Yeah.
He wanted cinema to change that relationship, maybe build mutual understanding.
That sounds like a really conscious effort to shift the power balance.
It absolutely was. And the broader cinema verite, or direct cinema movement, primarily in the US and Canada in the 1950s and 60s, embraced new technology, portable cameras, sync sound with the goal of capturing spontaneous, unstaged moments. The source highlights key figures like Robert Drew, Richard Leacock, D.A. Pennebaker, Frederick Wiseman, the Maysles brothers, giants of that style.
The idea being, if you're just recording spontaneously without interfering, you're getting closer to pure reality.
That was definitely the hope, the claim. But the debate immediately fired up again. Does this style really capture objective reality? Or is it simply a different form of manipulation through selection, through editing, and just through the undeniable influence of having a camera present?
Yeah, the camera always changes things.
Always. The source mentions critiques from other filmmakers, like Werner Herzog, who provocatively called cinema verite the cinema of accountants because he felt it limited itself only to surface reality, what was easily captured. And Errol Morris, another great documentarian, argued strongly against its claims of just passively unveiling reality.
So even the attempt to be purely observational couldn't escape the filmmaker's perspective and choices. It's that creative treatment, again, just wearing different clothes.
It always circles back to that, doesn't it? And the source also notes something incredibly important here. Indigenous groups are increasingly making their own films now.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, initiatives like taking pictures or video in the villages, this allows them to tell their own stories, represent themselves on their own terms, pushing back against those potentially patronizing outsider views that often dominated ethnographic film historically.
That feels like a crucial shift, giving the subjects, the camera, the agency over their own representation.
Absolutely vital. Okay, finally, the source brings up this vast, often overlooked area. Supported documentary.
Supported documentary, what does that cover? Never heard that term.
It covers films that are commissioned by specific clients, think corporations, NGOs, foundations, universities, government departments. They're made for all sorts of specific purposes: employee training, marketing, advocacy campaigns, internal communications, public information.
Wait, so like a corporate training video about workplace safety? That counts as a documentary according to this source.
According to this broad definition, yes. The source points out that while these films might not get theatrical releases or show up on Netflix, they represent a huge portion of global documentary production. They provide significant work for filmmakers, and honestly, they're often the most common type of documentary most people actually encounter day to day. Think about explainer videos for nonprofits, those campaign films you see online, university orientation videos.
Wow. Okay, I honestly never thought of those in the same category as, say, Nanook of the North or Man with a Movie Camera, but it makes perfect sense when you put it that way. They use the form claiming to show something real, but for a very specific client's purpose.
Exactly. And they just underline again that this creative treatment of actuality is happening everywhere across this massive range of films, not just the ones we typically think of as art documentaries or the ones on the big screen.
This whole journey through the history and the different styles is really fascinating, but let's bring it back to the listener for a second. Why does understanding all this, the debates, the different approaches, the history and light, why does it matter to you when you're sitting down to watch a doc tonight?
That's the key takeaway, really. Knowing this history, knowing about these different approaches, it fundamentally changes how you watch documentaries. It helps you become a much more critical viewer.
How does it change things, practically speaking?
Because you now understand that every single documentary involves deliberate choices. Choices about what to film, how to present it, importantly, what to leave out, and why the filmmaker is telling this particular story in this particular way. It allows you to think actively about the filmmaker's perspective, the potential influence of who funded the film, and how the style itself, the way it looks and feels, shapes the message you receive.
So it's not about being cynical and just distrusting all documentaries, but about engaging with them more actively, more thoughtfully.
Precisely. It lets you appreciate the immense skill and craft involved in making these often powerful films, while also critically evaluating the claims they're making about reality. It helps you recognize that what you're watching is always a representation of reality, filtered and shaped by purpose and perspective. Remember, it's not a window, it's a picture. And someone chose the frame, the light, the focus, the subject.
And checking out some of the variety mentioned in our source, like their list of 100 notable films, is a great way to actually see these different styles and historical examples for yourself.
Absolutely. That list is a fantastic resource, a practical way to see these concepts come to life right there on the screen.
Okay, so to kind of wrap up this deep dive, our source material really reveals that documentary is anything but a simple, objective window onto reality. It's this complex, crafted representation born from a rich history packed with differing visions and these ongoing debates about truth, purpose, and style.
And that conversation about credibility, perspective, the filmmaker's role, the ethics of representation, the viewer's understanding it, continues with every single documentary that gets produced and watched today. It's not settled history.
Which leaves us with this final thought for you to maybe mull over. If every documentary is at its heart a creative treatment of actuality, a picture shaped by deliberate choices, what responsibility do you, the viewer, have in actively interpreting those choices and deciding for yourself what you believe about the reality being presented on screen?